Hey my friends, how are ya? I have got a new paint along video for you today, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. Um, Rather than the whimsical style that I usually do, we're going to do something a little more painterly, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, let's not get stuck in the rut. I love everything whimsical, but every now and then it's fun to paint something different. And I want to show you this particular painting because it has some techniques that can carry over into other things you're painting. Um, so this is a fairly easy one, but I thought it would be kind of fun to show you the different techniques, and because it has a lot of different applications. With Valentine's Day coming up, today is January 29th, 30th. I don't even know what day I'm on. Today is January 30th, 2022, so we have Valentine's Day coming up, and then Mother's Day just a few months after that. So this is certainly something that you could use if you wanted to make your own card or a picture to frame as a gift, something like that. So today we're going to use watercolor paper. Any type of watercolor paper you have is fine, as long as it's 140 pounds or more. The higher the number, the thicker the paper. And all that means is the higher the number, the less it will warp when you paint on it. So 140 pounds is kind of the standard, but if you have heavier watercolor paper, that's certainly perfectly okay. I'm going to use a couple different brushes. If you don't have both of these, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to use my number 8 round that I use all the time, but then I'm also going to use this flat brush to get my background wet just because it covers more area. This is a 1-inch flat brush. If you don't have that, you can certainly do the same thing with this brush. It's just going to take you a little bit longer. So don't sweat if you don't have those exact brushes. Use what you've got that are close. I've got a plate that I'm going to use to mix some paint on. I'm going to use my Josie Lewis watercolor set today. No particular reason, that's just the one I grabbed. Her website is linked in the description, so if you're interested in getting those paints, her website's linked there, you can get it. I love this set. This is one of the ones I recommend to people just starting out because it's a good quality paint, but it's not terribly expensive. I think if you often start with like student grade paints, they can be a little frustrating to work with because they're not as creamy, they don't flow as well. This is a nice low-end professional set. It's not when I say low-end, I don't mean bad low-end, I mean less expensive low-end. Something like a Schmenka or a Daniel Smith or Cotman, some of those are more expensive. You're going to get similar flow and similar function out of these Josie Lewis paints. You're just not going to pay as much money. So that makes them a really good beginner set. I am going to use some tape. The Scotch Wall Safe tape is the tape that I like because it tends to not rip the edges. And my piece of watercolor paper I've cut down to 8 inches by 8 inches. So I'm going to paint on the 8 by 8, but I'm going to keep the piece I cut off handy because I think I'm going to need to mix my green, and I want to show you a little bit about mixing colors because we don't do that very often. I usually paint right out of the pan, but there is benefit in mixing colors, so I want to talk to you a little bit about that. So I'm going to use the scrap piece that I cut off to test my colors, and then I've got a couple of jars of water, 3 jars of water, like I usually do. That way I've got plenty to work with, and I can keep one just plain water for doing washes and things. Part of the reason I cut this down to 8 by 8 is because the technique I want to show you, I don't have a brush big enough to do it bigger and do it justice. This size will work really good for this number 8 brush, and a number 8 brush is pretty standard. I find that most people have something close to this size. So the 8 by 8 paper is going to work. If you have a great big brush and you want to do it bigger, certainly do it bigger. If you don't have a brush this big, you can make your paper a little bit smaller. There's nothing wrong with that. The other reason I like this 8 by 8 size is because you can buy 8 by 8 picture frames. So when I'm done with this, I can just slap it in this little frame and I'm good to go. I've got a gift already. Okay? So 8 by 8, cut your paper down if you need to. I'm going to tape it down to my board, and I think I've shown you these before. These are just canvas panels. You can get these at pretty much any art supply store. It's just a flat little board that has canvas surface on one side. I flip it over and tape to the back side because the back side is just paper. Your tape's not going to stick very well to the canvas side, but I like these because they're really inexpensive. You can get a pack of, I don't know, 8 or 10 of them for not very much money. And then you've got a couple of things you can use to tape your paper to, and have 3 or 4 things go on at one time if you want to. So I'm going to tape this down, and I'm not going to be real exact about the measurement. I'm going to put the tape down so that the midpoint of the tape is about where the line of the paper is. I have half the tape on this side and half the tape on that side. I'm not going to measure it and get real exact. I'm just going to eyeball it. And so we will tape this all the way around. What the taping down is going to do is 2 things. It's going to give us a little bit of a decorative border where they'll get a white border, so it's almost like a faux mat. When we're done painting, we'll pull this tape off and there will be a little bit of a white border around what we've painted. And the other thing this is going to do is hold the paper down, because the paper is going to want to warp when we're putting water on it. So I've got it taped down. I'm just going to go through and burnish the edges real quick with my thumb. So all I'm doing is just running over the edge where the tape meets the paper to make sure that's stuck down really good so that water's not going to seep underneath. And before I start, I want to talk to you a little bit about the colors I'm going to use, because I want to show you some color mixing stuff. The colors I'm going to use today, I think I'm going to use a blue. So something like that. That light's kind of bright, isn't it? Whoa. Maybe that won't glare. So I'm going to use a blue for my flowers, and I'm going to use a green for my stems. But what I want to show you is that I don't really care for any of the greens in this set the way they come out of the pans. So I'm going to mix my own green, and often with green that's a good way to go because you get a more realistic looking green. And I think you can see this one is really yellow, this one's kind of bluish, and this one's just really a vibrant green. I want something a little more muted and toned down. I like this lighter one as a starting spot. I like this darker one to darken it up a little bit, so I think I'm going to do a combination of these two, see what it looks like, and then I may add some brown into it as well. So what I'm going to do is get some of this lighter green paint, and all I'm doing is just dipping my brush in the water, swirling it around in my paint, and then wiping it on my plate. And I'm going to do the same thing with a little bit of the dark green. Now that dark green is really dark, so when I'm mixing, I'm not going to need a lot of that. So I'm going to start here and just pull in a little bit of that green at a time as I need to. And I'm anticipating that I might need some brown. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to grab some of the brown off my palette by getting my brush really wet, swiping it around, and then wiping it on my plate. Now I think while I'm here, I'm going to grab the blue that I'm going to use too. And then I'll just paint off this plate completely. So same thing, rinse your brush off, get it clean, come back with just a wet brush, smear it around in the color you want to use for your flowers. This is what I'm going to use the blue for. And just wipe it on your plate. So then we can just paint off this plate and not have to worry about the palette. Now, to mix my green, I'm going to rinse my brush off, and I'm just going to get a little bit of that darker green and mix it in here. I think I need a little bit more, so I'm going to grab a little bit more. Now I can tell by how that looks on the plate, it's still really bright. If you test a little bit on your paper, you can get a better idea what it's going to look like when it's painted. It's still a little brighter than I want it. I want it kind of muted down. So I'm going to grab a little bit of brown and mix it in. A little bit of brown can go a long way, so I would say start a little bit at a time. You can always add more brown to it. It's hard to take it away. So with a little bit of brown in there, I've now got a really toned down green. This is more of kind of a mossy green, and that's what I was looking for. So I started with this one, which is a really yellow green. I mixed in a little bit of this darker green that got me to here, and then I put a little bit of brown in it, which toned it down to more of a mossy color. So what I like about mixing the greens is that it gives you more depth than just using greens out of the pan. Oftentimes I have run across very few greens out of the pan that are really a nice green. There are a couple, but I specifically didn't want to use them today because I wanted to show you color mixing. We don't do this very often, and I think it's an important part of painting because it does give you so many options. You're not just stuck with what's in your pan. So certainly as you're practicing, as you're painting, play around with mixing different colors and see what you get. The general formula for a nice kind of toned down mossy green is starting with a lighter green and adding brown to it, or starting with a really light green, adding a darker green and a brown. Just, you can kind of play around with that combination. But I think I really like this mossier looking green. So that's what I'm going to use. And I've now got that mixed on my plate. So that's what I'm going to use my green from. Okay. So first thing we're going to do is put a little bit of a background on here. I want the background to be very, very light. And then we're going to paint our flowers on top. And we're not going to draw any of this on today. We're going to go completely freehand and wing it the entire time. I know some of you paint with your kids. You watch these with your kids and do them. I think the kids can do this. So certainly let them have a shot at it, okay? So the idea that I'm going to do with my background is I'm going to kind of visually divide this in thirds. So third, a third, 1, 2, 3. I want my top 2/3 to be blue for my sky. I want my bottom third to be green for my ground. And I'm going to use the blue that I'm going to use for my flower and the green that I'm going to use for my stems that I just mixed. But I'm going to use very little of them because I just want it to be kind of a hint of color. So the way we're going to do this is go ahead and just paint on plain water onto your background. Get the whole thing wet. And remember, we're not going for dripping wet. We're just going for a shiny sheen on the paper. And let me get this wet and I'll hold it up to the camera so you can see what I mean by shiny sheen. So just keep dipping your brush in clean water. I like to go back and forth one direction and then switch directions and go back and forth again because the paper has a little bit of a texture to it. And sometimes the brush can glide right over the top and the water doesn't get down in those textured spots. So go one direction, then go the other direction. If you feel like you need to come back and do it again, come back and do it again. So you get your whole paper nice and evenly wet. So if I hold this up in the light, you can see I've not got really any drips because I'm not going for drippy, but the whole paper has a shiny sheen on it, so I know that it's wet. Now with my round brush, I'm going to grab just a little bit of that green off my plate. So I just tipped my brush in it, and I'm just going to kind of smear it back and forth. And I don't want this to be very dark. So you can see this is really, really light. That's what I'm going for. And then I'm going to rinse my brush off and do the same thing with my blue. I'm going to use that for my sky and my flowers. Now, the nice part of these flat brushes is that once you've got a little bit of paint on there, I can come back with this flat brush and just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Spread that paint out. You can go the other direction, but then come back and just do big, long strokes. Those big, long strokes are going to avoid like spots in the middle where the brush taps down. And you can drag it right down into the bottom and you get a really nice mix between your blue and your green. And I know this is really light on camera. There's not a lot of paint on there. So it's really, really light. When it dries, it's going to be even lighter. And that's what I'm looking for. I want just a hint of color on the background. So with my color all spread out, I'm going to come back with my clean round brush. I rinsed it off. It's got just plain water on it. And I'm just going to tap it and let it make little spots of water here and there on the paper. If I hold this up, hopefully, can you see these nice little blooms right here? That's what the splashes of water on wet paint does. It spreads the paint out where that water hits it and makes bloom. It's called blooms, where it just makes kind of this round area that fans out. That's what I want on my paper, because again, that's going to be interesting background, but when it dries, it's going to be really, really light. So before we do anything else, we need to dry this. So pause your video here, either set this aside, let it dry for 5 or 10 minutes, or go hit it with a blow dryer and then come back and we'll put our flowers and the leaves and stems on top of this, okay? So I'm going to go dry mine real quick. Okay, I am back and mine is dry. I have zoomed in on this a little bit so you can see this dried really, really light. The colors are kind of almost barely there. So we're going to go back over the top and put our flowers on top of this in a little bit darker color so that they'll show up. And you can see these nice white spots in the background. Those are from the splatters of water on the wet paint. When that water hits the wet paint, it pushes it out and makes these nice splatter marks. Now, I love this effect for all kinds of backgrounds. You can do as many or as few splatters as you want. It's just completely up to what your eye thinks looks good. But I love that effect on the background. So what we're going to do now is put some flowers on top. We're not going to draw these first. We're going to do them freehand. So I'm going to take my clean round brush and the blue that I'm going to use for my flowers. I'm going to set this off to the side because I want to try and stay zoomed in on this as much as I can. So just know that I'm painting out of that blue I put on my plate earlier. And I'm going to zoom us in a little bit more here and see if we can do this. So when you're painting flowers, typically try to do flowers that have odd numbers of petals, because odd numbers tend to be a little more visually pleasing. So we're going to start with 3 petals. If we feel like we need to add more, we can add 2 more. We are going to do some little single blooms here and there. So the way we're going to do this is that I am just dragging the tip of my brush in that blue paint a little bit. So I've got a little bit of blue paint on my brush. And I'm going to decide where on here I want my first flower. It can be anywhere you want it to be. And all I'm going to do is drop 3 little dots of my paint in kind of a triangle shape. Okay, then I'm going to rinse my brush off. I'm not coming back with a really, really wet brush. I'm going to rinse it off and then I'm going to drag it on the edge. So it's not drippy, but it will still be wet. And I'm going to come in and drag these puddles of paint out to make my flower petals. So when you do this, think kind of dragging out here and out here, and then out here and out here and out here and out here, so that we have 3 really full flower petals. So I'm going to start by just putting the tip of my brush in this puddle of paint and kind of drag it out both directions, and then just use little strokes to pull it up. I'm going to do the same thing here. Out, out, little strokes to pull it up. Turn your paper if you need to, so that you've got a good angle. Put my brush in there, pull it out, out, and just a few little strokes to pull it out. So what we end up with there is just a really loose little flower. And we're going to come back when this is dry and put some stuff in the center so that we don't have a hole there. But you can see we've just got some really nice, loose little flower petals. If you did not make your petals wide enough and it feels like there's too much open space in here, you could do the same thing and add a couple more petals. Put a little dab of paint here and then pull it out. Little dab of paint here, pull it out. So you can do as many petals as you want to that way. I like to do mine nice and full like that, so I can just leave it at 3. Okay. Now I'm going to rinse my brush off so that it's just clean. I'm going to grab a little bit more paint off that blue, and I'm going to do just a single little bud right down in here. And I'm going to do it really similarly. I'm going to start with just a little dab of paint. I'm going to rinse my brush off, wipe it on the edge so it's not sopping wet, but it's clean. And this I'm going to pull out, but I'm going to pull it up to a point. Okay. So I started right here, pulled it out to a point and met itself. So it almost looks like the shape of a little Christmas light bulb or something. And we're going to continue to do that same thing in multiple places. Now remember, odd numbers tend to be more visually pleasing, so we're going for our odd numbers. So I'm going to do maybe another flower here and another flower over here, and then I might do a couple more odd buds here and there so that we've got our odd numbers. So I'm going to do them all exactly the same way. I start with just a little bit of blue paint on my brush. I'm going to put one up here a little bit higher, so I'm going to vary the height of them. And I'm going to put my little blobs of paint in a triangle, rinse my brush, wipe it off on the edge of your water cup, and then come in and pull out, and a few little strokes. Out, and a few little strokes. Now what you're going to notice is that your paint intensity is going to vary as you do this. And then same thing with this one. Drag it out, drag it out. Some are going to be lighter than others. If you feel like you want more color there, just grab a little more paint off your plate and just kind of tap it in so you make it a little bit darker. Okay. There, I turned the light down a little bit. Hopefully that will help. So I'm going to do that same thing again right over in here, starting with my 3 little blobs of paint in a triangle pattern. Rinse my brush, wipe it on the edge of my water container, and then come drag out and out. Think of just like a great big exaggerated U. Remember to turn your board if you want to, so that it's a little more comfortable angle for you to paint at. And I'm just doing the same thing, dragging out, dragging out. If you feel like you want more paint, grab just a little bit more off your plate, tap it around here and there. If you feel like you got too much, like this petal down here feels awfully dark to me, I'm going to rinse my brush off, dab it on a paper towel to dry it off a little bit, and then I'm going to come back and just drag my brush over the top. Because that brush is dry, it's going to pick up some of that paint. And then rinse it off, and you're good to go. So fairly quickly and easily, we've got 3 nice little flowers. That one bud makes an even number. I want an odd number, so I'm going to put another little bud in here somewhere. Might do 2 or 3 more just so we've got some. Maybe up here. I'm going to do one. Let's see. I'm going to start with my same little blob of paint, and I think I'm going to put another one down here. That gives me 6, so maybe I'll put one up here too. Oops. So those are just marking my spots where I'm going to make my buds. Sorry, off camera. And I'm going to do them the same way I did the petals. The only difference is I'm going to pull it up to a point and meet itself. I'm going to go there and there. Again, if it's too light, just tap some little paint in there. I'm going to make this one come this direction. And I'm going to make this one come this direction. What direction you choose to go with them is completely up to you. It's completely arbitrary. And with that, I've got my flowers in. Quick, easy way to do flowers. They don't really have a lot of structure. You don't have to draw them first. And you can play around with the shape. You don't have to make them, you know, kind of that U-shaped. You could make them more pointy and do more of them. You can play around and experiment with what you want your petals to look like. But that's a quick, easy way to do some nice, easy, loose flower petals. Okay? So before we do anything else, we need to dry this. So I'm going to pause mine here and go dry mine. You can do the same. Hit it with a blow dryer or set it aside, let it dry for 10 or 15 minutes, and then come back. Okay. My flower petals are all dry. So everything is laid down flat again. So we need to add some things to the middle, to our big flowers, and then we need to put our stems and leaves in. So for the middle of these big flowers, I'm just going to do little dots of that same blue color. So I'm going to grab some more of that blue color off my plate, and I've just run my brush through it a couple of times. And all I'm going to do is just tap, tap, tap in the center of that flower with some little dots. So I'm just going to kind of do that. Okay. We'll do the same thing over here with this one. Get a little more paint on your brush if you need to. And just kind of tap it around. This is in keeping with the loose nature of these flowers. We're not really going to define that center terribly, but we are going to put some color there so that we can definitely see there is a center to those flowers. Okay. Now we need to put some stems on these. So with that green that I mixed up, that's kind of a mossier colored green, I'm going to bring these stems all the way down to the bottom border of my painting. And you don't necessarily have to start them, anywhere specific. You could choose to come, like on this one, you could choose to come down this way. You're not going to go through the petal. You're actually going to start it right here where the petal ends, because the petal might be in front of that stem. So you don't have to look for like the V here and put your stem there. That's not necessarily the way they always are. So it's perfectly okay to come like from the middle of this petal down. You would just imagine that the petal is in front of that little piece of stem. Okay. When we do the buds, we're going to put a little bit of a green here at the end of the bud. Like with the bud, you often have that little leaf section right at the bottom end of it, and then bring the stems down for it as well. So I'm going to grab a little bit of that green paint, and I'm going to do this very, very lightly. I want just that nice pointy tip of my brush because I don't want these stems to be great huge. If you feel like you want to practice this before, certainly do that. Grab your scrap piece of paper, and we just want a little light touch so we get really narrow stems. In fact, that was probably a little too heavy because I was doing it in the air. I'm going to slide my painting aside for a second so I don't set it on top of those wet centers of my flowers. So with this setting down on the paper, if you put your hand down and use kind of your pinky as a stand, I just want to go really lightly and get really narrow stems. So you can see that was much better than when I did it holding the paper in the air. So I just want these to be really narrow. I don't want them to be great fat stems. And I want them to curve and have some movement to them. Okay, so I'm going to load up my brush, and I'm going to do this one first. And in my mind, I'm seeing the stem for this one come off this side this way. And I'm going to bring it all the way down to the bottom of my paper. So I'm going to start it kind of right here and just run it down. I'm going to grab this one, and I think I want it to cross that stem, so I'm going to run it down this way. And I'm going to bring this one down this side. Okay. Now for my buds, let me zoom you in here on this one. For my buds, I'm going to go get some more paint, and I'm not putting a ton on there. I don't want it to drip, but I do want to have a good load of paint on there. And I'm going to come do kind of a little V with a line in the middle at the bottom of my bud, and then run it down as well. Okay. Let's do the same thing at this one. I'm going to put kind of a little V with a line in the middle and run it down. And I'm going to do that same thing with my other two. Now, be careful, because on mine, these centers are still wet. So if I go over here to do this one, my chances of dragging my hand through that wet paint are pretty good. If you want to dry the centers of your flowers before you do the stems, absolutely go ahead. I normally would probably do that because I am notorious for dragging my hand through wet paint, but I'm going to try and do this really carefully. It's a little V with a line in the middle. And I'm going to bring this one down this way. This one over here, little V, a line in the middle. And I'm going to bring it like it's going behind that flower, right to there. Okay, so we've got our stems in. Keep in mind, those are going to dry a little bit lighter than they look right now. Watercolor always looks darker when it's wet, so those are going to dry a little bit lighter. I do want to put some leaves on this, and I want them to be kind of light, so I'm going to rinse my brush off and I'm going to go back to that green paint and kind of water it down a little bit. I've just put a little bit more water in it so that that just lightens it just a touch. And all I'm going to do is start my brush where I want the tip of my leaf to be, push it down, and pull it up as I meet the stem. If you want to, you can grab a little more paint and just dot it at the bottom, and it'll kind of climb its way back up. Tip of the brush where I want the top of the leaf to be, start dragging it, push the brush down, pull it back up as you meet the stem. And then I come back in and just dot a little bit of paint up there. If it's too light, you can drag the paint all the way back up if you want to. And I'm not going to put leaves on every single one of them. I'm just going to put a few here and there to kind of accent what I've done. If you think it's too light, just grab some more paint, add to it. And darken it back up a little bit. I think I watered my paint down a little bit too much, so I am going back and grabbing a little more paint to put on there. But that's the way you fix those things. You know, if you overdo it with water, just grab a little bit more paint and put a little bit more paint on it, and you're good to go. Okay, so there we go. I'm going to add some paint splotches on here as well, but I want to dry this first. So again, set it aside, let it dry for 10 or 15 minutes, or go hit it with the blow dryer, which I'm going to do with mine, and I will be right back. Okay, I'm back with mine dry. You can see those leaves and stems dried lighter than they were when they were wet, so they don't look quite as garish as they did. They don't look like they're disproportionately dark to the flowers that we have going on. So we've built quite a bit of depth into this just by using layers of paint, and that's part of what I wanted to show you with this one today. One thing was that you don't have to draw everything first. You can kind of wing it and still come out with something that looks really pretty, and that we can add depth with the paint. The first layer was really, really light to give us that hint of background, and when we come back over that with a little more paint, it stands out from that background, so you look like you've got background in the back and things in the foreground, so you've got that depth. And then every little bit of dark and other layer that we add on top just adds more to that. Okay, I am going to add a few splatters on this just because I want to. I like paint splatters. So what I'm going to do, I don't want them to be really, really dark though, so I'm going to really water down this blue paint. I'm just dipping my brush in my water and really watering this down. The more water you put in watercolor, the lighter it's going to get. So I want this really soupy. And I've got my brush really loaded. And I'm going to come right over the top and just gently tap. Don't tap too hard or you end up with great huge splatters. I just want a few little splatters here and there. And I think I'm going to do the same thing with my green, just so I've got both colors in there. So I'm watering down my green over here on the side as well. And I'm going to do the same thing. Just come back and tap here and there. Some of them are going on top of your flowers, and that's completely okay. Okay, so at this point, I would call this one done for what I wanted to do today. It's not really whimsical like I normally do, but I wanted to show you something a little bit more painterly, I guess would be the term we would use. I think knowing different techniques like this gives you options with your painting. So you don't always have to do something in one particular style if you don't want to. This is really lovely to use for homemade cards. You can buy watercolor cards and actually do something like this on top of it. If you've just got regular blank cards already, you don't want to go buy specific watercolor cards. And when I say watercolor cards, they're blank white greeting cards made of watercolor paper so that you can paint on top of them. But if you just have some blank cards and you don't want to specifically go buy watercolor cards, you can just cut your paper down to the size of the front of the card or a little bit smaller. Do your painting and then attach this to the front of the card with glue or with double stick tape or something like that. So you can still make your own homemade cards even if you don't have specific watercolor cards, you can still accomplish the same thing. I love this because you could use it for a card, or because of the way I sized it, I could just stick it in this 8x8 frame. It looks like it has a little matting around it already because of that tape border that we had, and you could give that as a gift. Okay, now because we're all about options, if you'd prefer to have it more whimsical, certainly let all this dry and you could come back with a black pen and real loosely outline some of these. Just put a line here and there in the stems, a line here and there in the flowers. You can do it whichever way you want to. This way is more classically watercolor painting, but certainly if you want to whimsy it up, have at it. A little bit of black pen, a little bit of white pen here and there, really loose outlines would be really, really cute on this. And I may do that when I'm done with the video just so I can show you at the end the options you've got. But for right now, I would call that good. You could do it in any color. Excuse me. You could do it in any colors you want. I went kind of traditional with little blue flowers and green stems, but certainly, you know, if you wanted hot pink flowers with purple stems, why not? There are no rules in the world of your imagination, so certainly you could do this in whatever colors you want. And like I said, the size of your brush, I mentioned at the beginning, the size of your brush will change how this looks. If you want to do little tiny ones of these, use a smaller brush. If you want to do great huge ones, use a bigger brush. And I do have a bit of a bigger brush, but I don't like this brush, so that's why I didn't want to use it. But if you have a bigger brush, you know, you can do these bigger. You could certainly do them bigger with the number 8 brush that I used. It would just take a little more effort to do it, but it's certainly doable. I find it's just, you know, nice and simple and easy when you can just do a couple of strokes this way and still end up with something nice and fun. So if you're going to call it good there, sign it. Don't forget to sign it. Put your name or your initials and the date on it. I love to put dates on things because then I can look back and see how my skills have grown over time. But that makes a nice little gift or the front of a card. So there you go for today. A little bit different than what we've done. But like I said, I just wanted to show you something to kind of help your skills grow and give you another tool in your toolbox for ways to do things. You don't always have to draw things first. Sometimes you can just wing it and it's still going to come out really, really cool. So with that, I'm going to let you go for today. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you haven't, if you're enjoying these videos. I would also ask a favor of you. A lot of you have asked about a donation button so that you can help support these videos, and I love you for that. I hadn't done that to begin with because my whole goal with these is to help people start creating, and particularly people who might not think of themselves as artists or particularly creative, to show you that a lot of these skills are learned. Some people do have natural talent, yes, but you don't have to have natural talent to enjoy making art. So that was the point of these videos to begin with, but there is a cost to making them, and I do have a full-time job. I would really love for this to be my full-time job, and I'm working towards that. So I would ask a favor. If you're watching these videos and if you enjoy them, if you wouldn't mind hitting that donate button, and even just $1. If everybody that followed and watched these donated $1 each time you watched a video and appreciated it, I could make this my full-time job. So there's a donate button in the description. If you feel called to do that, I would certainly appreciate it. It helps pay for the software, and if enough people donate, frees up some of my time so I could do more videos for you. I did quite a few of them over the last few years when things were kind of shut down with COVID, and I wasn't working as much, but now that things are open back up, at least here where I am, I'm back to work full time, and so that kind of cuts down on my art and video time, but I would really love to have more time to do these for you. So there you go. If you have any questions on what we did, absolutely put those in the comments. I will read those and answer those, and as always, you're welcome, and certainly I would love for you to follow along. If you've got Instagram, I do have Facebook, but I'm not there as much as I'm on Instagram, but I'm at Painted Willow Art on both of them. I am also at Painted Willow Art on Pinterest, and on Pinterest I pin and save lots of fun ideas, so if you're looking for inspiration, you can check that out, and there's all kinds of cool stuff, not just stuff that I've created, but stuff that a bunch of different people have created, so that there's an inspiration bank for you there as well. With that, I'm going to let you go. Have a good day, and have fun with the painting. Thanks, everybody. Hey, I'm going to jump back in with a PS here real quick because I forgot to mention what to do with your plate when you're done. You know, we mixed up some of these colors and put a pile of blue, even though we didn't really mix that color, on our plate to paint off of. What do you do with this when you're done? Part of the beauty of watercolors is that they can dry out and be reused, unlike acrylics and oils. So if you think these are colors you might use again, just let it sit and dry. They're going to dry out. You can see this one's kind of dried out over here. They're going to dry out. So once they're dry, they're not going to slide off your plate. You can move this plate around wherever you want once they're dry. When you're ready to use these colors again, just come in with some water, swirl them around with your brush, and they reactivate and they're good to use again. So you can certainly just let that sit and dry and then be able to use those same colors again later. I actually have... Pardon me, I don't have my camera on the stand because this was an afterthought. This is the plate I paint off most of the time, and I rarely wash it. You can see it's all dried out, nothing's going anywhere. So you can set it aside, put it anywhere you want, but you can come back with a wet brush, re-wet that, and use any of those colors anytime. So certainly hang on to that and just let them dry if you want to. If you don't think you're going to use those colors again for anything, just go run that under the sink, under the water, and they wash right off. That's why I love using like regular dinner plates. Plastic plates, paper plates are not fantastic for mixing watercolor because they want to soak into the plastic or the paper. But using regular dish plates, it sits on top. So it's a really nice mixing surface. It will dry, stay sitting on top. You can re-wet it and use it again. They're not going to soak in. But because they don't soak in, when you're done with it, just go run it under the faucet and they rinse right off. And you're good to go next time. So there you go. Thanks, everybody.